cunning could survive. In the east, beyond the Bone Mountains and the Shadowlands, other mysteries stirred in the ancient cities of Yiti and the distant realms of the Sunrise Kingdoms. These were lands so far from Westeros that they seemed like myths to the lords of the Seven Kingdoms. Places where the very sun rose differently and the seasons followed patterns unknown to Western minds. The Emperor of Yiti ruled from his golden throne in the city of Yin, commanding armies that numbered in the millions and fleets that could darken the Jade Sea. But these eastern powers remained focused on their own affairs. Their attention turned inward toward their own ancient rivalries and eternal conflicts. The free cities that would later dominate the western shores of Essos were beginning to emerge during this period, founded by refugees and exiles from the various conflicts that swept across the continent. Braavos, greatest of them all, was still hidden in its secret lagoon. Its founders sworn to secrecy about the location of their new home. The city was built by escaped slaves and their descendants, men and women who had fled the chains of Valyria and other slaveholding powers, to create a new kind of society based on freedom and commerce rather than conquest and domination. The other free cities had their own origins and their own characters. Pentos grew fat on trade, its merchant princes growing wealthy by serving as middlemen between the various powers of the continent. Mary became famous for its craftsmen, who created goods of such quality that they were prized throughout the known world. Liz developed a reputation for both beauty and decadence, its pleasure houses and its poisons equally renowned. Each city was a world unto itself, with its own laws and customs, its own alliances and enemies. Volantis, the first daughter of Valyria, remained the greatest of the free cities throughout this period. Built on the model of the Great Dragon capital, it sought to inherit the mantle of Valyrian supremacy over the eastern continent. The old blood families that ruled the city claimed descent from the ancient dragon lords, and they maintained many of the traditions and practices of their ancestors. The black walls of Volantis enclosed a district where only those of pure Valyrian blood were permitted to dwell, while the rest of the city housed a vast population of slaves and freedmen who served their Valyrian masters. The slave trade that would define so much of Essos in later ages was reaching new heights during this period. The constant wars and raids that swept across the continent provided a steady supply of captives, while the growing wealth of the free cities created an insatiable demand for labor. Great slave markets arose in Lys and Naran Tyros, where human beings were bought and sold like cattle. The profits from this trade funded the armies and fleets that the free cities used to maintain their independence and expand their influence. Yet, even as some cities grew rich on the misery of others, the seeds of their own destruction were being sown. The slave revolts that periodically swept through the eastern continent grew larger and more organized with each passing generation. The gladiator pits of Meereen and the fighting schools of the other Slavers' Bay cities produced warriors who knew no fear and had nothing left to lose. The Unsullied, the elite slave soldiers of Astapor, were created during this period. Their brutal training methods producing the most disciplined and effective infantry in the known world. The religions of Essos were as diverse as its peoples, reflecting the complex tapestry of cultures that had come together on the eastern continent. The Lord of Light, whose red priests preached of the eternal struggle between fire and shadow, was gaining followers throughout the free cities and beyond. The many-faced god of Braavos offered death as a gift to those who suffered, while the horse god of the Dothraki demanded blood and victory from his followers. In the Far East, the followers of the Lion of Night and the Maiden Maid of Light engaged in theological debates that had raged for thousands of years. The Faceless Men, the legendary assassins of Braavos, were founded during this period by slaves who had learned to worship death as the ultimate escape from suffering. They developed their arts in secret, learning to change their faces and their identities as easily as other men change their clothes. The gift they offered was available to all slave and free alike, but the price they demanded was beyond the reach of most. They served no king and followed no flag, but they shaped the destiny of nations through the careful application of their deadly skills. Magic, which had been commonplace in the days of old Valyria, was becoming rarer and more mysterious as the years passed. The Dragon Lords had hoarded their secrets jealously, and much of their knowledge died with them in the various wars and disasters that befell their empire. The surviving sorcerers and magicians found themselves increasingly isolated, their powers weakened by the changing nature of the world. Some claimed that magic itself was fading from the world, that the Age of Wonders was ending, and the age of mundane reality was beginning. Yet in certain places, the old powers still stirred. The Shadowlands beyond Ashai remained as mysterious and dangerous as ever, their dark cities inhabited by sorcerers and demons whose purposes were known only to themselves. The ruins of Old Giz still echoed with the ghosts of the Harpy Queens, and the bones of dragons could still be found in the wastelands where the great beasts had fallen in the wars of conquest. The world was changing, but it had not yet forgotten the lessons of its magical past. The stage was being set for the next great drama in the history of the world. The Valyrian Freehold was approaching the height of its power, its dragon lords preparing for the conquests that would make them the undisputed masters of the known world. But their very success was breeding the conditions for their eventual downfall. As the curse of the Royer worked its slow poison through their society, and the contradictions of their slave-based economy grew more and more apparent, the wheel of history continued to turn, carrying all the peoples of Essos toward a future that none of them could foresee. The Age of Heroes was ending in the East, as it had in the West, replaced by an age of empires and trade, of slavery and freedom, of magic and mundane reality existing side by side in an uneasy balance. The Game of Thrones was being played on a larger board than ever before, with stakes that would determine the fate of entire continents. In the eastern reaches of Essos, where the summer sea lapped against volcanic shores, and the earth itself burned with ancient fire, there arose the greatest empire the world had ever known. Valyria began as little more than a collection of shepherd villages clustered around the 14 flames, those great volcanoes that pierced the sky like spears thrown by the gods themselves. The people who would become the Dragon Lords were unremarkable in those early days, just another tribe among many who scratched out a living from the harsh volcanic soil and the few hardy animals that could survive in that burning landscape. But beneath their feet lay something that would change the course of history forever. The volcanic activity that made their homeland so inhospitable also created something unique and precious: dragon glass, the black volcanic rock that could cut through steel and hold an edge sharper than any metal blade. More importantly, the constant volcanic activity had awakened something ancient in the depths of the earth. Creatures that had slumbered since the dawn of the world. Dragons, the children of fire and stone, began to emerge from the deepest caves and the hottest lava flows. The first dragon taming was not a conquest, but a partnership born of mutual need. The early Valyrians discovered that the great beasts were not mindless monsters, but intelligent creatures capable of forming bonds with those brave enough to approach them. The dragons needed the volcanic heat to survive and thrive, while the Valyrians needed protection from the harsh environment and the other peoples who coveted their lands. Over generations, certain bloodlines developed the ability to communicate with dragons, to understand their needs and desires, and eventually to ride them through the burning skies. The secret of dragon bonding lay in the blood itself, a magical heritage that was passed down through the great families that would come to rule the Valyrian freehold. These Dragon Lord bloodlines guarded their secrets jealously, intermarrying among themselves to keep their magical abilities pure and strong. They developed elaborate rituals and ceremonies around the bonding process, creating a mystical connection between rider and dragon that went beyond mere training or dominance. The dragon became an extension of the rider's will, while the rider became the embodiment of the dragon's power. As the Valyrians mastered the art of dragon riding, they also developed other magical arts that would set them apart from every other civilization in the known world. They learned to work with fire, as the warrior had worked with water, bending flame to their will and using it to create wonders that defied explanation. Their smiths discovered the secret of Valyrian steel, a metal so superior to ordinary steel that a Valyrian blade could cut through armor as if it were cloth. The forging process required not just skill, but magic, binding spells into the very metal that made it lighter, stronger, and sharper than any weapon that had come before. The roads of the Valyrian freehold were another marvel that showcased their mastery over the elements. Built from fused dragonstone hewn, these highways stretched across continents without a single joint or seam, as if they had been poured from molten rock in a single continuous process. The roads could bear any weight, withstand any weather, and last for centuries without maintenance. They became the arteries of empire, allowing Valyrian armies to move with unprecedented speed across vast distances, while Valyrian merchants could transport goods safely to territories that had previously been impassable. The architecture of Old Valyria itself was a testament to the power and ambition of the Dragon Lords. Their towers rose like frozen flames toward the sky, spiraling ever upward in defiance of gravity and common sense. The buildings seemed to grow from the volcanic rock itself, shaped by magic as much as by mortal hands. Great pyramids housed the dragon pits where the mighty beasts were born and raised, while elegant palaces provided homes worthy of those who commanded such power. The very air above the city was filled with dragons, their wings casting shadows over the streets below as they soared between the towers in an endless aerial dance. The government of the Valyrian freehold was unlike anything that had come before or would come after. Rather than being ruled by a single emperor or king, the empire was governed by a council of dragon lord families, each wielding power proportional to the number and size of the dragons they commanded. This system created a delicate balance of power that prevented any single family from dominating the others, while ensuring that decisions were made by those who truly understood the forces they were dealing with. The great families of Valyria became as legendary as their dragons, the Targaryens, with their silver gold hair and purple eyes, the Valyrians who commanded the seas, the Celtigars who read the future in flame and smoke. The expansion of the Valyrian freehold began slowly with exploratory flights that mapped the known world from the sky. The Dragon Lords discovered that their aerial advantage allowed them to see patterns and opportunities that ground-based civilizations had missed. They could identify weak points in enemy defenses, spot resources and trade routes from above, and strike at targets that their enemies thought were safely beyond reach. The psychological impact of dragons was almost as powerful as their physical capabilities. Entire armies would break and flee at the sight of the great beasts approaching from the sky. The conquest of the Gishkari Empire marked the true beginning of Valyrian dominance over the eastern continent. The Gishkari had ruled the shores of Slaver's Bay for thousands of years, their harpy queens commanding vast armies of slave soldiers, and their great pyramids standing as monuments to their ancient power. They had weathered countless invasions and survived numerous wars, their civilization enduring through adaptability and cunning. But they had never faced an enemy that could strike from the sky with fire and fury. The war between Valyria and Geese lasted for centuries, a series of conflicts that became known as the Gishkari Wars. Each side adapted to the other's tactics, with the Gishkari developing new weapons and strategies to counter the dragon threat. While the Valyrians refined their aerial combat techniques and developed new breeds of dragons specialized for different types of warfare. The Great Pyramids of the Gishkari cities were transformed into fortresses designed to withstand dragonfire, while the Valyrians created dragons bred specifically for siege warfare, capable of melting stone and metal with their breath. The final victory came not through a single decisive battle. The final victory came not through a single decisive battle. The final victory came not through a single decisive battle. The final victory came not through a single decisive battle. The final victory came not through a single decisive battle. Their civilization enduring through adaptability and cunning. But they had never faced an enemy that could strike from the sky with fire and fury. The final victory came not through but through the systematic destruction of the Gishkari way of life. The Valyrians used their dragons to destroy the irrigation systems that fed the Gishkari cities, to burn the slave markets that were the foundation of their economy, and to hunt down the harpy queens who had ruled for so long. When the last Gishkari city fell, its pyramids were left as empty monuments to a vanished civilization, while the survivors were absorbed into the growing Valyrian Empire as slaves and servants. The defeat of Gers established the pattern that would define Valyrian expansion for the next several centuries. Unlike other conquerors who sought merely to extract tribute or established trading posts, the Valyrians completely transformed the societies they conquered. They imposed their language, their customs, and their system of slavery on the defeated peoples, creating a uniform imperial culture that stretched across vast distances. The dragons served not just as weapons of war, but as symbols of Valyrian authority, flying patrols over the conquered territories to remind the subject peoples of the power that held them in bondage. The slave system that supported the Valyrian Empire was vast and complex, involving millions of human beings who had been reduced to property. The Valyrians categorized their slaves according to their capabilities and origins, creating specialized classes for different types of work. The Unsullied warrior eunuchs were bred and trained in Slavers' Bay to serve as the Empire's infantry, while skilled craftsmen from conquered cities were put to work, creating the luxury goods that the Dragon Lords demanded. The mines beneath the 14 Flames consumed thousands of slaves each year, working them to death in the hellish conditions needed to extract the precious metals and gems that funded the imperial system. Yet for all its cruelty, the Valyrian system also created unprecedented prosperity for those at the top of the hierarchy. The Dragon Lord families lived in luxury that surpassed anything the world had ever seen, dwelling in palaces that floated on clouds of magic and feasting on delicacies brought from the farthest corners of the known world. They commanded not just dragons, but entire fleets of ships, vast armies of slaves and sellswords, and treasuries that could fund wars lasting for decades. For the wealth that flowed into Old Valyria transformed the city into a wonder of the world. Place where magic and technology combined to create marvels that seemed impossible to outside observers. The Valyrian approach to magic was fundamentally different from that of other civilizations, where the children of the forest worked with the natural world and the warrior sought harmony with the flow of water. The Valyrians sought to dominate and control the forces of nature. They practiced blood magic and fire magic, arts that required sacrifice and suffering to achieve their effects. The great works of Valyrian sorcery were paid for in pain, built on foundations of bones and watered with tears. This approach to magic gave them immense power in the short term, but it also created instabilities and contradictions that would eventually contribute to their downfall. The religion of the Valyrians was as complex and contradictory as their approach to magic. They worshipped dozens of gods, many of them borrowed from conquered peoples and adapted to Valyrian needs. The most important of these was Valyrian the Black Dread, a god of fire and death who was said to be the father of all dragons. The Valyrians built great temples to their gods, but they also treated them as tools to be used rather than masters to be served. Their priests were as much sorcerers as holy men, using their divine connections to work magic that enhanced the power of the Dragon Lord families. As the centuries passed, the Valyrian freehold reached heights of power that no empire before or since has matched. Their dragons darkened the skies over 3 continents. Their roads connected distant lands in a network of trade and communication. And their fleets ruled the seas from the Summer Sea to the Shivering Sea. The Dragon Lords themselves became like gods, wielding power over life and death, commanding the very elements and living lives that stretched far beyond the normal span of mortal years. But even at the height of their power, the seeds of destruction were being sown. The constant intermarriage among the Dragon Lord families was beginning to take its toll, creating bloodlines that were increasingly unstable and prone to madness. The vast slave system that supported their civilization was becoming more and more difficult to maintain, requiring ever more brutal methods of control. As the enslaved populations grew larger and more restive, the magic that had given them their power was exacting an ever greater price, demanding more blood and more pain with each passing generation. The curse that Prince Garin had laid upon the Valyrians during his defeat was working its slow poison through their society, manifesting as the Grey Death that turned men to stone from within. The disease spread quietly through the Dragon Lord families, killing some and weakening others, creating gaps in their ranks that were filled by younger, less experienced riders. The bonds between dragons and their riders began to weaken as the bloodlines became more diluted, leading to accidents and rebellions that had been unthinkable in earlier generations. Most ominously of all, the 14 Flames themselves were beginning to show signs of instability. The volcanic activity that had created the dragons and sustained Valyrian power was growing more violent and unpredictable. The earth trembled more frequently. The lava flows burned hotter, and strange gases began to seep from cracks in the ground. The Valyrian sorcerers assured their lords that all was well, that their magic could control even the fires of the earth itself. But some among them had begun to sense that forces beyond their comprehension was stirring in the depths below. The Targaryens, one of the lesser Dragon Lord families, were among the first to sense the coming doom. Their gift for prophetic dreams had warned them of disaster, visions of fire and ash that would consume everything they had built. While other families dismissed these warnings as superstition or cowardice, the Targaryens quietly began to prepare for the worst. They moved their dragons to their holdings on Dragonstone, a volcanic island in the Narrow Sea that would provide refuge when the homeland burned. The height of Valyrian power was also the beginning of its end, though none save the Targaryens suspected what was coming. The empire had grown so vast and complex that it was becoming impossible to govern effectively. While the contradictions inherent in their system of magic and slavery were creating pressures that no amount of dragon power could contain, the wheel of history was turning once again, carrying the greatest empire the world had ever known toward a doom that would reshape the very geography of the eastern continent. The Dragon Lords flew through their burning skies, masters of all they surveyed, unaware that their time was running out. The doom of Valyria was approaching, and with it would come the end of an age and the scattering of power to the far corners of the world. The Game of Thrones was about to become infinitely more complex as the survivors of the coming catastrophe would carry their ambitions and their dragons to distant shores where new kingdoms waited to be born or conquered. The signs of the coming catastrophe had been building for years, but the Dragon Lords of Valyria were too proud and too powerful to heed the warnings that whispered through their smoking halls. The 14 Flames, those great volcanoes that had been the source of their strength, began to rumble with an anger that seemed to come from the very heart of the world. The earth trembled beneath the feet of slaves and masters alike, and the air itself grew thick with ash and sulfur that burned the lungs and stung the eyes. Strange lights danced in the night sky above Old Valyria, aurora-like phenomena that the court sorcerers claimed were merely the reflection of dragon fire on the clouds, but which filled those who saw them with an inexplicable dread. The dragons themselves began to behave strangely in those final years. Beasts that had been docile and obedient for generations suddenly turned savage, attacking their handlers and even their bonded riders. Some dragons simply disappeared, vanishing into the volcanic depths from which their ancestors had first emerged, as if they sensed the coming doom and sought to escape it by returning to the fire that had birthed them. Others grew listless and refused to fly, spending their days coiled around the spires of their masters' towers, keening with voices that sounded almost human in their despair. The dreams came to the Targaryens with increasing frequency and intensity as the end approached. Dance the Dreamer, daughter of Lord Anna Targaryen, was plagued by visions of fire and ash, of dragons screaming as they fell from poisoned skies, of the great city of Old Valyria crumbling into the sea. Her dreams were so vivid and terrifying that she would wake screaming, her bedclothes soaked with sweat and her silver gold hair wild with terror. When she told her father what she had seen, he listened with the gravity that prophetic dreams deserved in a family known for their gift of foresight. Lord Anna Targaryen faced a choice that would determine the fate of his house for generations to come. He could dismiss his daughter's dreams as the product of a young mind stressed by the strange events occurring around them, or he could act on what she had seen and abandon everything his family had built in Valyria. The Targaryens were not the greatest of the Dragon Lord families, but they were far from the least. They commanded 5 dragons, controlled vast estates, worked by thousands of slaves, and held positions of honor and influence in the Freehold's governing council. To abandon all of this based on dreams would mark them as cowards or madmen in the eyes of their peers. But Andar Targaryen was wise enough to know that the gift of prophetic dreams had never been wrong in his family's history. When Dany's visions grew stronger and more detailed, showing not just the destruction of Valyria, but the specific mechanisms by which it would occur, he made the decision that would save his house from extinction. He began to quietly liquidate his family's holdings in Valyria, selling their estates and converting their wealth into portable forms. He claimed that he was simply diversifying his investments, exploring opportunities in the western reaches of the empire. But in truth, he was preparing for a permanent exodus. The other Dragon Lord families watched the Targaryen preparations with a mixture of amusement and contempt. They mocked Annanar for his apparent cowardice, calling him the exile and suggesting that he was fleeing from imaginary threats. Some made offers to buy his remaining holdings at prices far below their true value, seeing an opportunity to profit from what they perceived as Targaryen weakness. The great families of Valyria had grown complacent in their power, unable to imagine that anything could threaten the empire they had built with fire and blood. Dragonstone had been a Targaryen holding for centuries, a volcanic island in the narrow sea that served as an outpost for their trading ventures and a refuge for their dragons during the hottest months of summer. The island's strategic location made it valuable for controlling shipping routes between Essos and Westeros, while its volcanic nature provided the heat and sulfur that dragons needed to thrive. As Annuar prepared for his family's departure, he began to fortify Dragonstone and stock it with supplies, transforming it from a simple trading post into a potential seat of power. The move to Dragonstone was accomplished gradually over the course of several years, allowing the Targaryens to avoid drawing too much attention to their preparations. They transported their most valuable possessions in small shipments, claiming that they were simply sending goods to their western holdings for safekeeping. Their dragons were moved one at a time, with explanations about needing them for various business ventures or explorations. By the time the other Dragon Lord families realized the full extent of the Targaryen exodus, it was too late to prevent or interfere with their departure. The final year before the Doom was marked by increasingly strange and ominous events throughout the Valyrian heartland. The very air seemed to shimmer with heat, even in the depths of winter, and the lava flows from the 14 flames began to glow with colors that had never been seen before. The slaves who worked the mines beneath the volcanoes reported hearing voices in the darkness, speaking in languages that predated human civilization. Many of these workers simply disappeared, their bodies never found, leaving only empty tunnels that echoed with the sound of something vast and ancient stirring in the depths. The sorcerers of Valyria had always prided themselves on their mastery over the forces of fire and earth, but they found themselves increasingly unable to control or even understand what was happening beneath their feet. Spells that had worked reliably for centuries began to fail or produce unexpected results. Rituals that had once summoned dragons from the depths now brought forth only ash and poisonous gas. The very magic that had built the Valyrian Empire seemed to be turning against its masters, as if the forces they had bound and commanded for so long were finally breaking free of their constraints. Some of the wiser sorcerers began to whisper about the true cost of Valyrian magic, about the sacrifices and suffering that had powered their great works for centuries. They spoke of blood debts that could never be repaid, of cosmic balances that had been disturbed beyond repair. The Royer curse, pronounced by Prince Garin centuries earlier as he died in his golden cage, was remembered by a few scholars who wondered if the slow-working poison of the Great Death was just the beginning of a greater reckoning. The common people of Valyria, both slave and free, began to flee the city in growing numbers as the Bolnans multiplied and the very ground beneath their feet grew hot to the touch. But the Dragon Lords remained either unable to believe that their power could be threatened or unwilling to abandon the source of their authority. They convened emergency sessions of the Governing Council, debating what actions should be taken to address the growing crisis. Some proposed great rituals of appeasement, offering massive sacrifices to whatever forces were causing the disturbances. Others suggested military solutions, as if dragons and swords could somehow battle the earth itself. The night before the doom, the last night that all Valyria would ever see, the 14 Flames fell silent for the first time in recorded history. The constant rumbling that had been the background music of the city for generations simply stopped, leaving an eerie quiet that was somehow more terrifying than the loudest volcanic roar. The dragons throughout the city began to keen in unison, their voices rising in a lament that seemed to mourn the passing of an age. Those few who survived to tell the tale later said that the silence was the most frightening sound they had ever heard. When the doom came, it came without warning and beyond all comprehension. The 14 Flames erupted simultaneously with a violence that defied all previous understanding of volcanic activity. But this was more than a natural disaster. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart above the Valyrian Peninsula. The explosions that followed were heard as far away as Old Tan and Ashai, great thunderclaps that seemed to come from the throat of the world itself. The sky above Valyria turned black as night in the space of minutes, filled with ash and fire and things that had no names in any human language. The dragons died first, their riders clinging to their backs as the great beasts plummeted from poison skies. The magical bonds that had connected the Dragon Lord families to their mounts for generations were severed in an instant, leaving both dragons and riders screaming as they fell into the chaos below. The strongest and largest of the dragons, those ancient beasts that had lived for centuries and commanded the respect of nations, simply dissolved into ash and bone, their forms too fragile to survive in the transformed world that was being born from the destruction of the old. The city of Old Valyria itself lasted perhaps an hour after the initial eruption, its magical protections and mighty walls proving useless against forces that operated on a scale beyond mortal comprehension. The Greek pyramids that had housed the Dragon Lords crumbled like sand castles before a tide, while the roads of fused dragonstone cracked and shattered, their magical bindings undone by the raw chaos that swept across the land. The very geography of the region was transformed as mountains sank into the earth and new peaks thrust up from the depths to scrape the burning sky. The human cost of the doom was beyond calculation. Hundreds of thousands died in the first hour alone, incinerated by lava flows that moved faster than a horse could run, or crushed beneath falling buildings. or simply torn apart by the magical forces that had been unleashed. The great Dragon Lord families that had ruled an empire spanning 3 continents were extinguished in a matter of minutes, their bloodlines ending in fire and ash. Centuries of accumulated knowledge